a longtime AA member, told me the story once about sharing his fifth step with his sponsor. The idea in a 12-step program at that point is to make a fearless and searching moral inventory, all the times that you've fallen short, and then share it honestly with yourself and your higher power and with another person. And all this is not meant as punishment or humiliation. This isn't confession. It's a facing of the past. It's a facing of yourself. It's a rigorous practice of being honest with who you are and who you've been and where you've come from. Can't go forward without that. So my friend sat down with his sponsor at the dining room table across from each other with 5 or 10 typewritten pages in front of him. And he started talking what he had done and what he hadn't done in the grip of the addiction. And sometimes he wept, and sometimes it was hard to say the words out loud that were on the page. And sometimes he didn't recognize the person who had done those things, who was him. And sometimes he did. And through all of this, his sponsor, this other man, sits across the table from him, listening, watching, nodding sometimes with eyes closed. An hour or more of this, on and on, page after page. And at the end, his sponsor says, "Is there anything else?" This is the first question he's asked, the first words he's spoken. Is there anything else? And then in the silence of a subtle shake of the head, he smiled and made a deep eye contact and said, "Okay, you're a person, not more, not less." This is listening into speech. It's a making of space for the whole and honest and difficult and complicated story to come out. Space enough to hold all of it without resolution, without moral. Space enough for the shy soul to emerge, that deep, real self. When you speak to me about your deepest questions, says one author, you don't want to be fixed or saved. Not when you speak to me about your deepest questions and struggles. You're not saying them to me in order for me to resolve them for you. You're not unburdening your spirit in order that I give you the solution to that problem. When you speak to me about your deepest questions, you don't want to be fixed or saved. You want to be seen and heard, to have your truth acknowledged and honored, taken seriously. And this kind of listening into speech is, of course, not just for the worst and most difficult things, but for soul stories. A lot of the time, we tell ego stories instead of soul stories, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just not the sort of thing that we're gathered in church in this community to work on. Ego stories. Stories told for the sake of self-promotion. When you apply for a job, that is not the time to unburden yourself of your deepest stories you rarely tell. That's the time to tell an ego story. Focus on life's high spots when you've been successful and affirmed, and show how you are in control and in charge of your life. Ego stories like that are linear stories of continuity and consistency. stories with a resolution. I used to tell people when I worked in the corporate world and would talk to people who were looking at moving to a new position, changing to a different team, I would say, tell the story of your career as if every single step was an inevitable and perfect trajectory leading to this next job. And of course, that's not how careers work for the most part. That's not how lives work. But that's an ego story. Highly crafted stories that leave out highly important things, which are always told in prose and sometimes involve numbers and do not sustain us in times of suffering. Your resume is not a consolation when you're mourning the death of a loved one. These are the stories we tell at a party when someone says, "What do you do?" Zhuangzi, the Taoist philosopher 2.5 millennia ago, puts this, he has this epigram, he says, "Produce, get results, make money, make friends, make changes, or you will die of despair." I love it. This is like 2.5 millennia old sarcasm. But contrast those ego stories with soul stories. Soul stories are the story beneath the ego story. They're the ones with the thread of truth running and weaving and tangled and knotted through the middle of them. Soul stories honor shadow as well as light, suffering as well as gladness. Soul stories are the stories of twists and turns when our best laid plans were undone by the unexpected. Soul stories let you integrate the fragments into the whole of yourself, rather than denying those pieces of you and your life. Soul stories are unafraid of change and fear and loss and failure and shame and mystery and passion and ecstasy. We tell them sometimes in poetry and music and art. They're the stories we hang on to in the hardest times. They're the stories we want the people we love the most to know. They're the stories that we relive at 3 a.m. or when we're dying. They're the stories that feel vulnerable. And this is a concept from Parker Palmer, the Quaker teacher, this distinction of ego and soul stories. But it's true for us, too. A friend reminded me that Unitarian Universalism is about connection. And we're a religion that sees people struggling, not against our own sinful souls, but against a shallow and frantic and materialistic world that is all too often disconnecting us from our deepest selves, disconnecting us from life's gifts, disconnecting us from needs greater than our own. We're struggling against this narrow freedom that says what counts as freedom means you do whatever you want. A freedom from instead of a freedom for. And this tradition is not about that. This congregation is not about that. We work at our best to heal that divide by helping each other listen to our deepest selves. Listen each other into speech, open to life's gifts, serve needs greater than our own. To reconnect. In an article on the surprising pleasure of not talking, Jaded Nahasandra and John Spavdi write that listening is the foundation of conversation. Through hearing others carefully, we can step imaginatively, empathetically into their shoes, experience the world from an entirely different point of view, if only for a few moments. Listening between the lines, hearing the feeling, the intention, as well as the words. It takes an incredible discipline. Active listening is not easy. You think way faster than you speak. When you're listening, it's so easy to tune out a speaker and just listen to your own ideas. This is so much of what we're rewarded for. I feel like so often we're rewarded for being right, not for understanding deeply. We're rewarded for the best line or quip or thesis, for the best idea, not for how well we hear each other, how completely we're able to put ourselves into each other's experience. It's easy to tune a speaker out and turn over your own ideas. Ask yourself instead how the person speaking feels about the subject. Look at their body language, their expressions. Note the words, the nonverbal signals, and then notice which of those words trigger reactions inside you automatically. When are you reacting merely because a speaker used a certain word? Listen. Are they using it the same way you are? And if you aren't sure, ask for clarification rather than arguing about what it means. It's hard though, because when you listen deeply to others, and this is my experience in leading small groups and the Soul Matters groups here, you may very well find yourself without anything clever or moving to say when your turn comes around. Doing peace circles, when I went to the training a year and a half ago now with our other peace circle leaders here in the congregation, I felt that as the talking piece moved around the circle, and one after another, people shared deeply and vulnerably, and I turned the whole of myself to listening. I realized when the talking piece came to the person next to me, I didn't have the slightest clue what I was going to say in the circle. And that's a hard thing for a person who's used to knowing what to say and having something to say. For a person probably like you, too, ready with words to add. But that lack of preparation is a blessing because it gives you access to spontaneous and heartfelt words. So slow yourself down in conversation and watch gently when your focus comes off of them and back into you again. Trust yourself that there is time and space in you to think and turn over and process and analyze everything that's being said, but in the moment instead. Set that down and return yourself to listening again. Deep listening is a spiritual practice, in part because the nature of our minds is to be in motion. Our brains are wiggly things, like little ones who just want to stay constantly moving and move away and bring the attention away from the wholeness of the person that you're engaged with, back to ourselves again, back to our own thoughts or reactions or guilt or shame, all of these traps that keep us stuck inside us instead of engaged with each other. Van Ogden Vogt, minister here many, many years ago, said that part of the work of church is to become a person among people. That encounter requires deep listening, requires the practice, the intention of a deep engagement with the other person. Otherwise, you become a person in a room full of shadows, in a room full of people who are somehow less real and whole and complete and broken than you are. But the work is to become a person among people, not to become a person all by yourself. The Jewish philosopher Martin Buber put it a different way. He talked about that sort of relationship as treating the other person whole and holy. He said that for him, what God is, what the substance of the holy is literally that thing that happens between two people who encounter each other in that way. It's a practice, gently to bring your attention back again to your listening, and to be easy with yourself while you do it, and to look at that worry about what you're going to say next and just gently set it down and return to them again. Return to all those things in them that there are to hear and discover if only we pay attention with all of our being and ourselves that we can bring. And then you lose it and find it again and again and again. Amen.